Hi, I'm Michael Lind, the Whitehead Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to host for a conversation today on Blogging Heads Daniel Deudney, author of a major new work about world politics and international relations theory, Bounding Power, Republican Security Theory from the Polis to the Global Village. Here's the cover, designed by the author himself, he tells me. Daniel Deudney is associate professor at Johns Hopkins University, where he won the Alumni Distinguished Faculty Teaching Award in 2005. He was educated at Yale, George Washington University, and Princeton, which bestowed a master's degree and a PhD on him. His areas of research are general international relations theory and international political theory, as well as contemporary global issues, such as nuclear issues, environment, and outer space. But we're here today to talk in particular about his new book, Bounding Power, which in my view, and the view of a number of people, including John Eikenberry, who wrote a remarkable rave review for Foreign Affairs, is one of the signal contributions to international relations theory of recent decades. So welcome, Daniel.
Thank you.
Well, you say from Republican security theory from the polis to the global village, but I understand you have some reservations about the global village as a metaphor. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. Certainly the most important mental image that people need to have to understand where we are now is global. The frame of the nation state, the frame of territorially specific places is now obsolete. And unless we have a global frame, we are obsolete. But it's important that we move beyond simply embracing the global and get an image of the global which is actually appropriate to our situation. And over the last several decades, we've had different global images that have been vying for this new paradigm, this new narrative. And perhaps the most dominant one is Marshall McLuhan's notion of a global village. He coined this in the 1960s, specifically with regard to the new information, connectivity, and proximity that was emerging at that time, and of course has subsequently been cascading. And that is an image which is valuable because it's global, but the village part of it is in a profound way misleading, because the village, the connotation of a village is that we have a quiet place, a relatively static place, potentially a relatively homogeneous place. And that image misses the fact that the global system is extremely heterogeneous and that it is also very much in motion. The dynamism, the acceleration of historical change that has been producing the global is left out of that narrative, or left out of that image. Another image that we have from Buckminster Fuller is Spaceship Earth, and this is an image that builds from a much longer lineage of notions about the ship of state as a community that is navigating treacherous and hostile waters and is organized hierarchically. The captain is navigating and the crew is implementing orders. They're going from one place to another. That image of global village, global Spaceship Earth, is taken by Fuller in a direction which is even more authoritarian than the traditional ship of state image, because it suggests, and he actually develops this in his work, that there would be an operating manual for Spaceship Earth, and the spaceship metaphor as a ship metaphor is also suggestive of a hierarchy. You're part of the crew, or you're a passenger. Passengers take orders. The captain's not elected by anybody. You're either crew or you're passengers or you're cargo. So there's a hierarchical agenda implicit in that image. It's a technocratic, hierarchical image of the global. So those two images, I think, are fatally flawed. And I propose an alternative to that, something that I refer to as the global debris mat, and that the objective of our practice has got to be to convert this debris mat into a raft. Raft is, of course, much more primitive than a ship, and the notion that we're going to have steerage capacity on a global scale analogous to that of a ship is far beyond the realm of the probable or possible for many decades. So we have a much lowered ambition to get a raft, to convert this debris mat into a raft. And the debris mat image is also attempting to capture a feature of the, the global situation that many Americans tend to take for granted, which is that the globalization has been a process that's been the dominant narrative, in world politics for the last half millennium, for 500 years. Globalization occurring in 4 dimensions: in a military strategic, an economic, an ecological, and a cultural. 4 dimensions of globalization have been the overall trajectory of the human species over these 5 centuries. And Americans tend to live in a very privileged position within this, and we tend to be forgetful of just how privileged we have been. And to capture that sense of our position and the sense of change which has occurred, I think of this the contemporary world order as a raft, which has sort of minimal capacities. People on the raft, this is the United States of America and its democratic allies, more prosperous, more free, more secure than ever before in history. This raft, most of the people are above water, but this raft is impinged upon. This raft is enmeshed with a large amount of debris, smaller, less seaworthy rafts. And over the last 5 centuries, what has in effect happened, to spin this metaphor out a further step, is that the human species envision them as being on multiple slow-moving tributaries, different clusters of debris, different smaller rafts. And over the last 5 centuries, all of these different tributaries have come together. We're now one river. And over these last 5 centuries, the experience of most peoples has been anything but favorable. We tend to forget this in the United States, that globalization has entailed genocide, has entailed mass enslavement, has entailed massive plagues, has entailed world wars, tens of millions of people killed in various ways, tens of millions of people subordinated in various ways. And these polities that have crashed together, that are now enmeshed in our raft, many of the people on them are barely their heads above water. They're not rafts at all. They're meshes of logs and debris and branches. And the United States is irreversibly now enmeshed in this. Our capacity to steer has now been fundamentally altered. And given this image of colliding, uniting debris mats and rafts into this giant agglomeration, at the center of which still sits the United States, the project of what we need to be doing emerges quite clearly, which is to say that we need to reconfigure this debris mat into something approximating a raft. We've got to move towards raft craft. And this is a low image in a sense of global governance as opposed to the ship image. And we also should remember, as this metaphor clearly evokes, that the trajectory of movement that over the last 5 centuries has taken us together in this way has not stopped. Indeed, it is accelerating. And so as we look into the future on our river, we see that the body of water is narrowing. Walls are rising on the side. There's a speeding up of our movement. We look ahead, there's mist and fog, and we begin to sense that there's rapids ahead. And there are going to be significant shocks. There are going to be punctuations that are going to strike rocks, and we've got to develop a capacity to begin to steer this mass, to begin to configure it into a raft so that we can steer our way through these perilous future waters.
Well, that's a fascinating metaphor, and let's explore the idea of raft craft. I like that phrase a little further. Just to tease it out, the different rivers whose confluence you're talking about presumably are different regional civilizations and different societies that are coming together as a result of the expansion of European imperialism, technology, commerce, and so on. And I'd like to ask you the question, in both schools of thought that dominate discourse about foreign affairs in the United States today, both liberal internationalism and realism, or realpolitik as it's sometimes called, takes for granted the existence of a state system, of a society of sovereign states, which interact either brutally and aggressively under realism or in a more harmonious, interdependent way in liberal internationalism. But historically, state systems have been the exception, not the rule, right?
That's right. We are not only privileged in the United States because of the tremendous success of the Republican and federal and capitalist project, but we also are the privileged heirs of a European tradition that emphasized political plurality at an international system level, as opposed to, as you point out, the much more dominant historical pattern, which is that of a regional empire. And the early modern Europeans, when they were beginning to understand their political order, particularly in the 18th century, in the high water period of the Enlightenment, they recognized that the dominant political inheritance coming from ancient Rome and from medieval Europe emphasized that unity through empire was the standard form for political organization over large spaces. Now, of course, this wasn't global. These were regional systems. And, of course, prior to the last several centuries, the world was not one. The world was a series of regional state systems. And the pattern within these regional state systems, this has been copiously documented by various historians and historical sociologists, the dominant pattern is towards imperial consolidation, towards the elimination of political plurality at the system level. Within the Western experience, that was, of course, the Roman Imperium in the ancient Mediterranean world. But in other comparably populated, sized areas with comparable material civilization or even superior civilization, such as India and China and the Near East and also in the New World to a degree, we saw consolidations into imperial, in the language of early modern Europe, universal monarchy. And the inheritance from medieval Europe and from the Roman imperial period emphasized that this was necessary for peace, that if you wanted to have peace, you had to have unity, you had to have integration. And it was at this juncture in early modern Europe that the Europeans began to realize that their political order, the European state system as they began to call it, was not a universal monarchy in either decay or in formation. That somehow they had reached an equilibrium, a rough equilibrium of plurality. And it was at this point that the Europeans really invented international relations theory, international system theory of different states that together make up a system. And the language that they used to describe this system at the beginning, and the first conceptualizations of it, we've forgotten this almost entirely, was that Europe as a whole was a republic. This, during the Enlightenment, was actually a commonplace formation. Figures such as Montesquieu and Burke and Vattel, Voltaire, used this formulation. Europe.
Now, this is different from the situation in the ancient world. Let's say in ancient Greece, where there was a sense of cultural unity but there wasn't a sense of all of the Hellenic city-states being part of a single system.
That's right. The Greeks did not really have a gelled system of a gelled notion of an international system. And the Greeks, of course, did have the pan-Hellenic dimensions, and the early modern Europeans understood that they had certain elements of culture in common. But what they meant in referring to Europe as a whole, as a republic, was that it was a plural political order that was constituted by restraints. They clearly didn't want to say that Europe was a city-state. Rather, it was plural and constituted by restraints. Now, the restraints that they identified were actually in the material context. They were, if you will, part of geopolitics in the old sense of the term, about geography and technology as forming this environment of restraint or empowerment for political actors.
Well, specifically, what were those?
Specifically, they referred to Europe as a whole as being constituted by, this is Republican language again, division, which restrained power, balance, which restrained power, and mixture, which restrained power. And what they meant by division was what we would now call topographical fragmentation. That is to say that the presence of mountain ranges and bodies of water and rivers and insular polities made the projection of land power, made the projection of military power much more difficult in Europe. And we actually see this argument being repeated, vindicated by almost all historians of the European state system.
Yeah, it's basically plausible, isn't it, that you could have these small city republics, and even the nation states of Europe later on, both in ancient Greece and in Europe, because these were mountainous regions surrounded by water.
That's right.
Compared to great plains that the Mongol hordes could conquer.
That's precisely right. Geopolitics, in this sense of reading the material context, goes all the way back to the beginning of Western thought about politics. It's in Aristotle and in the early modern period Montesquieu in his work The Spirit of the Laws, which is like the most important major synthesis of Enlightenment political thought, has multiple geopolitical, in the sense of material contextual factors.
You find this in the Federalist Papers too, as well.
Exactly. And of course, the authors of the Federalist Papers were close students of Montesquieu. And so the idea is that Europe was topographically fragmented, and also there was a balance, a rough equality of size of the units. That was again attributable to the areas of fertile land for state formation to occur. And then there was also mixture, and by that they meant there was land power plus sea power interacting. And sea power gave the system a resilience, because sea power, eventually concentrated in the hands of Great Britain, was able to help shore up the balance against those who would overthrow it, but was itself not capable of overthrowing the balance, because its sea power was not capable of conquering territory.
So from this point of view, the mere existence of a diverse society of states, whether it was the city-states in ancient Greece or the nation-states in Europe, was sort of a fluke of history.
It was understood to be the result of highly contingent geographical features. And when the Europeans spoke of Europe as a whole, as a republic, they were underscoring that this was an anomalous formation. And it was anomalous vis-a-vis the larger regions. And in drawing upon the language of the republic, understood as power restraint, plural political order, they were also drawing on what they understood to be a political anomaly, which is to say free government. The European tradition of thinking about free government, of course, goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, and the overwhelmingly dominant tenor of this thought is that it was highly pessimistic with regard to the prospects for political liberty. Aside from the fact that only those with relative leisure, relative wealth could participate in politics because of the underdeveloped capabilities of production. More importantly, they understood Republican forms as limited because they understood republics as being dependent upon various geographical advantages on islands or on peninsulas, or positioned in state systems that were themselves anomalous, where smaller regimes would be viable. There was this overwhelming assumption from the beginning of Greek political thought until the eve of the American founding that to be a republic invariably meant one had to be small. Large regimes were understood as either monarchies or even at the largest scale, a region-wide empire was understood as invariably tending towards extreme of hierarchy of despotism. So they understood the prospect for political liberty as one which was very, very circumscribed because of this size attribute that they took as intrinsic to be what the republic was.
Well, in Bounding Power, you talk about the extremes of anarchy and hierarchy, and that one of the projects of Republican political thought was to avoid both. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yes. The argument that I just laid out about the European state system as a type of republic points to a fact which has been widely overlooked, which is that the main ideas that we now associate with realism, in this case the balance of power and the anarchy problematique, the idea that a state system can be a stable anarchy constituted by various restraints, particularly balance, these ideas, as ideas from liberalism, democratic peace, commercial peace, international unions, these ideas were originally conceptualized in the language of republicanism.
For our audience, not all of whom may be conversant with IR theory, can you explain some of these ideas, democratic peace and commercial peace, these liberal theories?
Yes. The contemporary landscape with regard to international relations theory is extremely heterogeneous. There's all these different theoretical approaches. But when it comes to security, it's widely recognized that realism is hegemonic. And that liberalism is its primary challenge. So we have within this heterogeneous landscape of theory these two clusters, realism, hegemonic with regard to security, and then liberalism as a challenger. And both liberalism and realism are themselves heterogeneous, but three of the main ideas that make up contemporary realism are the idea of anarchy, or what's called the anarchy problematique, that the international system is given a very distinctive character because of the absence of government. Anarchy in this sense doesn't mean chaos, it means absence of government. And various dynamics are understood to characterize international systems because they are anarchic. This is core of what realist international thought tells us. Then realism tells us that the balance of power, the distribution of power between the actors, is of central importance in sustaining anarchy, sustaining plurality, and that a concentration of power at the system level within the hands of one unit would alter the system in the direction of out of anarchy into an empire, into the more standard historically form of hierarchy and imperial. So
you're implying that realist theorists, the theorists of realpolitik, have taken what were actual features of the European state system in the 18th and 19th century and tried to generalize this as though the local customs of a Europe, which by the way no longer exists, of course, were sort of universal human truths about power and security.
That's right. Realism today is hegemonic because...
Well, by hegemonic you mean it dominates the university.
Yes, that's correct. It dominates the theory
doesn't dominate the
conversation.
World.
No, it doesn't dominate the world. Well, and it has become much more influential in the United States. Since the Second World War, and largely because of the experience of the World Wars and the Long War, the Cold War, the United States constructed a national security apparatus for the first time and kept it in place over decades. And realism became the dominant operative ideology, providing the roadmap of the world for the American national security state.
Well, let's talk about this a bit before getting back on the main road. This is an interesting byway, which is the history of realist history. There are a lot of people running around today who are convinced that there's a timeless realpolitik tradition that goes back to Thucydides or Machiavelli or Sun Tzu or some other ancient, iconic figure. Now, one of the things you write about in passing in Bounding Power is that this is kind of a modern fabrication, that it's sort of a fabricated tradition.
Yes, this is actually one of my starting points, which is that this contemporary landscape dominated by realism and then its challenger liberalism is actually a 20th century construction. Realism seems to be so powerful and seems to have so much authority because it claims to be the distillation of the best of Western thinking about these issues going all the way back to the Greeks. Major luminaries such as Thucydides and Machiavelli and Hobbes and Rousseau are characterized by contemporary realists as early realists, as people who pioneered the key notions that the modern synthesis of realism embodies. So it has this tremendous authority and prestige because of this historical lineage. Now, the reality of this is very different. The term realpolitik was actually coined in the middle of the 19th century, and the figures that I just mentioned, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Rousseau, they did innovate key notions that are now associated with realism, but they did so in the conceptual vocabulary of republicanism, and they commonly wrote not about international relations in general, but about the polities with which they were associated, which tended to be the Republican and proto-liberal polities. And so Republican international theory was international theory, and realism and liberalism, as we understand them in the 20th century, are essentially fragments, important fragments, but nevertheless fragments of this larger body of thought that I call Republican security theory.
Which in Bounding Power you try to reconstruct from the bits and pieces that have been carted off by the vandals of the realist and liberal schools.
That's right. I'm not writing a prehistory of realism or liberalism here. I'm attempting to reconstruct the main line of Western thought about security, political order, and political liberty that realism and liberalism are but fragments of. I'm trying to see this whole from which these powerful contemporary fragments derive.
So let's make it clear, you're not claiming to be original. This isn't your theory you came up with, sitting in a library. This is something that you argue existed, that this is in fact an older tradition in the West and the U.S. that you're renovating and updating.
That's correct. This is a reconstruction. I'm basically saying that we have lost sight of the actuality of our security tradition, and that the realism and liberalism, which are now dominant, do not do it full justice and leave us somewhat empty-handed in attempting to grapple with these issues of globalization and the survival of political liberty in an increasingly globalized world. So I'm not trying to create a new theory. I'm not trying to create a new tradition. I am attempting to recover in its full conceptual range what I claim is our tradition. When I say our, I mean the West, and particularly the United States of America.
Well, let's talk about the United States. You write about what you call the Philadelphian system as opposed to the Westphalian system. Can you explain both of those terms?
Yes. When we think about the trajectory of the development of republicanism over time, the founding of the United States is a watershed development. And I perhaps at this point ought to say a word or two about what I mean by republicanism. Okay, I pointed out that realism and liberalism's main ideas are fragments of it. But what in simple terms is republicanism? Republicanism is about popular sovereignty, it's about limited government, it's about political liberty, the preservation of political plurality so that we can have political liberty. But the simplest version of what I mean by Republican security theory is that security from violence, and this is the single most elemental problem of all political life. Americans take this for granted. Security from violence requires the simultaneous avoidance of the extremes of anarchy and of hierarchy. Simultaneous avoidance.
By hierarchy, you mean empire and dictatorship.
Exactly.
Autocracy.
Hierarchy is state, hard state, totalitarian, authoritarian, the domination, power domination through violence and coercion, which for most people, through much of even the 20th century, has been the norm rather than the exception. And of course, Americans take the control of hierarchy domestically for granted as well, at least most Americans. So it's the simultaneous avoidance. Republicanism seeks the simultaneous avoidance of anarchy and hierarchy over successively larger spatial scales as technology changes.
Well, you use the term negarchy to describe the alternative to anarchy and hierarchy.
Yes, the alternative to anarchy and hierarchy is the Republican form. And, of course, everyone's aware of republics, but we tend to not think about republics as security systems. When we look at the language of security studies and of international relations about security, it's overwhelmingly dominated by realism, and realism operates with a very simple understanding of political order, that states, countries are islands of hierarchy in a sea of anarchy.
Well, this has struck me in respect, with respect to this, the public discourse about failed states. The premise is that the only legitimate, valid state is a kind of 19th century Prussian-type bureaucratic state that monopolizes violence. And so if you look at Lebanon or Iraq, where you have militias and they're sort of partly in the government, partly out, there's no single control by bureaucratic salaried officials, of all of the guns in the country. Then you say this is a failed state, but the founders in the United States, obviously they didn't want, warring tribal militias, but they didn't want, a centralized bureaucratic government monopolizing the means of coercion.
That's absolutely right, and we tend to forget that. And these hierarchical forms, totalitarianism in our century, earlier forms of highly hierarchical class rule, were the norm, and republics were understood as anomalous. And republics, of course, are attempting to preserve the political liberty, or attempting to preserve the populace as a whole from predation, from violent and coercive predation by a central government.
Well, just on that point, I had the occasion recently to look into what did natural rights theorists of the 16th, 17th century have in mind as the ultimate natural rights. And again, you came up with in Locke and Grotius and others. They're basically two: the right to life and the right to subsistence. In other words, the right not to be arbitrarily murdered by someone.
That's
and also
correct.
The right not to have your food stolen from you, by the landlord.
That's correct.
And beyond that, so it's often said this was an idealistic sort of tradition, but it was avoiding the most basic kinds of parasitism by one predatory group of humans on another.
That's right. After the agricultural revolution occurring in core areas thousands of years ago, the dominant political form in segmented and functionally differentiated, i.e. advanced societies, tended to be ruled by military castes. Predatory military groups dominated, and then they had various priests who provided them with legitimacy. That was the template.
They still do in some places.
Yes, they do. Well, the important point to remember is that our political tradition that the United States of America embodies was the most advanced version of this attempt to simultaneously avoid anarchy and to avoid hierarchy. The American founding was not simply to get out of a state of nature anarchy, but was also to prevent a universal monarch, a central state, a monopoly of violence.
Well, let's explore that a bit more, because I think the concept is difficult for a lot of us to follow, that the North American state system, that is the Federal Republic, was seen not simply as one of a number of states that then gets slotted into the European great power system, but sort of as an alternative to great power politics in the way that the EU sometimes today holds itself.
That's right. That's very important for us to remember that. And that understanding of the American founding has fallen by the wayside, but it was the dominant understanding at the time of the founding. And I refer to, the first American Constitution, 1787, and thereafter, as the Philadelphian system. And I do so to underscore the key point that the founders understood the American Union that they were putting into effect, not simply as another state within the European state system that was expanding to global scale, but rather as an alternative system to the European system. And so we commonly refer to the European state system in the early modern period as the Westphalian system after the Treaty of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, at which point European politics had crystallized into an anarchic state system. That's the common language. And the American founders were keenly aware of the logic of that, of the dynamics of it, of its tendencies, and they were determined to avoid the recreation of a Westphalian-type state system in North America.
Well, this is something I found in my own research, and you've come across this as recently as the 1940s. In World War II, you had Americans saying that the U.S. itself was this first alternative and embryo world order, and then with the Monroe Doctrine, it expanded to include all of the post-colonial republics of North America, the Open Door Doctrine, which prevented China from being colonized by the Europeans. That added China, at least in theory. And so finally, with the Atlantic Charter of the United Nations, you get this expansion of this rival, ultimately American-inspired system to encompass the world. And this is quite different from the realist story, which is that the European state system simply became globalized by some mysterious method in 1945.
That's right. This is very important that we all remember this, because it is an extension of that project that we need to be doing now. And the United States was founded as an alternative to the Westphalian state system, and the 13 units that came together and joined the United States did so for a variety of reasons, but the most important ones had to do with security. And of course they were concerned about European reconquest, because they were all small and weak, and were really protected by their distance from Europe to a significant degree. But they also understood that if the 13 units stayed in anarchy, if they didn't have common government between them, then there would be a tendency for them to have conflicts and to build up their military capacities and to have wars. The first Federalist Papers clearly articulate this as the default trajectory if they don't have the Union. Now, they saw that Westphalianization that would have occurred had the Union not been established. They saw that Westphalianization, they saw that preservation of anarchy among the units as a threat to liberty and limited government constitutionalism within the units. Each of these 13 units, these 13 states, they were republics. They had limited government, constitutional, political arrangements, very precocious for their time.
Well, they're guaranteed a republican form of government by the Constitution.
That's correct. And the key point here is that they wanted to join the Constitution. They wanted to establish what I could say a kind of not an overthrow, but a throw over. They wanted to establish a union, a republic of republics, or in Madison's term, a compound republic, in order to get out of anarchy, because if they stayed in anarchy, then they understood that war would ensue, and as war ensued, they would have standing armies which over time would lead to the destruction of limited government constitutionalism.
So in the 19th century, the main threat was seen as internal anarchy, or the breakup of the Union. It wasn't conquest by external powers. But how's that changed with the Industrial Revolution and the industrialization of war in the late 19th, early 20th centuries?
A crucial threshold occurs in the late 19th and early 20th century because of the Industrial Revolution. At the time of the founding, the founders believed that this union that they were creating could get by with a very small central government, and most importantly, a very small standing army, a very small permanent military establishment. It was necessary to interact with the Europeans to keep them at bay, but it could be kept very small because the Atlantic Ocean provided this tremendous defensive buffer or barrier to the United States. As we enter the late 19th and early 20th century, there's this widespread recognition that the value of that moat of the Atlantic Ocean as a defensive barrier is starting to diminish seriously. And this is the period of the Industrial Revolution being experienced all over the planet in various major pockets, and the period of global geopolitics, the recognition that these previously loosely knit regional systems were now part of one global state system.
Well, this is something you and I have both written about, you in Bounding Power, and me in my book, The American Way of Strategy. When Woodrow Wilson said we needed to make the world safe for democracy, he didn't mean crusades to impose multi-party elections on everybody around the world. What he meant was that in a world dominated by a few industrialized militaristic empires, and the fact that they were industrialized, as you point out, is important because the previous empires were kind of very weak. They were sort of trading post empires, but by the 19th, 20th century, if the Germans had organized all of Europe as an autocratic empire, they'd have vast human and material and technological resources. And if the U.S. were isolated in a world of a few high-tech autocracies, then the danger was we would become a garrison state. And so that was really the theme.
That's right.
Of making the world safe for democracy. Now,
that's right.
Now, presumably, if the world were safe for the American democracy, if security costs were low, then it would be safe for other democracies too, if they had the local conditions that permitted them to have democratic government. But this is sort of a theme that is no longer understood.
That's right. As you point out in your book very nicely, this period of the middle years of the 20th century was one in which liberal democracy was on the ropes. This notion of an inevitable trajectory to some sort of end of history of global democratic regimes was very, very far from where we were headed. Democracies had failed and been overrun, and there weren't very many to begin with in the periphery of Eurasia. And these gargantuan, totalitarian complexes, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union were forming. And there was the fear that even if the United States was big enough because of its size and because of its industrialization to survive as an independent state in this global era, Spengler referred to as the era of the age of contending states, global great power war, we could survive, but in the course of surviving, in the course of generating and sustaining the military capacity necessary to preserve our independence, we would then have produced a garrison state, in the language of this period, Harold Laswell and others. We would invariably tend to become like our adversaries. And so that was a great fear that we had. And it's at this period, the period of the late 19th and early 20th century, faced with this new industrial material context, faced with this new increasingly coupled global state system with these continental-sized actors. It's at this juncture that American liberal internationalism as a program is articulated. And today, the liberal internationalist agenda is in retreat in various ways. It is fragmented.
But you argue that the problem with the contemporary versions of American liberal internationalism is this whole idea of a system of security. its sense for democracy has kind of vanished in favor of humanitarian intervention or
contemporary liberal
combating global warming and various other laudable things.
Exactly. Contemporary liberal internationalism has very important and very well-developed policy agendas in environment and other areas. But as a whole, it's like a donut, which is to say that the middle is missing, and it's very disconnected from the American political tradition increasingly. And what I try to do in Bounding Power is to provide the basis for reconnecting the liberal internationalist agenda to the logic of the founding. And that is to say that the reason we needed to make the world safe for democracy, the reason that we needed to abridge international anarchy for the purposes of restraining war among states, was not for humanitarian reasons, was not because we wanted to go around and be global do-gooders. That was a benefit, of course. Peace is good in these ways. But the underlying logic of American liberal internationalism is domestic regime conservative. That is to say, it's to save the Constitution. It's to prevent the limited government Constitution from being destroyed.
It's to save it from ourselves. Because we will sacrifice our liberty to gain our security if the world becomes dangerous enough.
That's correct. The first objective is security from outside threats, and if that is a severe enough danger, we will, in solving that problem, create the instrumentalities for our domestic corruption of the Constitution and ultimately loss of political liberty and despotism.
Well, let's bring this up to date. In the aftermath of the Cold War, there's still some muted great power rivalries. But is it your opinion that the threat from anarchy now, after 9/11, is the greatest threat?
Well, this takes us across the nuclear divide in the middle years of the 20th century, and the nuclear revolution, seemed to have occurred already. Many people think, we have deterrence, and therefore we've dealt with that. And the deterrence solution set is very appealing because it enables us to stay in an anarchy at a global scale and have security and have peace. It's like
the idea that states will monopolize nuclear weapons and they'll intimidate each other into not using them. That's
correct.
Balance of terror.
That's correct. And that war between great powers that have nuclear weapons becomes a probability of zero. Now, that may be an optimistic reading of the history of the Cold War, but that's the dominant sort of view. And in the 1990s, we had a tremendous optimism, both because the arsenals were going down and because the deterrence logic seemed to have been widely accepted by the leading states. And, of course, the end of the Soviet Union was a contributor to all of this. But that sense of complacency and optimism, in my view, came metaphorically crashing down on 9/11. There was a halcyon interregnum between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Twin Towers, when we had this type of optimism. And what 9/11 is a marker. It's not really the threat of airliners into skyscrapers. I think of the 9/11 as a bolt of lightning on a dark night which temporarily illuminates a very ominous new landscape. And the ominous new landscape is, of course, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of non-state actors. The leakage of this violence capacity, previously monopolized by states, into the hands of entities, the hands of actors that are the size of criminal gangs. And this is something that we are, of course, very aware of in the United States, and perhaps even hysterically aware of. The war on terrorism and so forth has been amped up for domestic political advantage over the last few years. But there is a fundamental reality here that we have to grapple with. And this is a reality.
You wouldn't limit this to nuclear weapons only.
No, we wouldn't. And of course, nuclear is now, but we're also faced with the prospect of biologicals, and that's going to be much more difficult to restrain than nuclear, because nuclear could be comprehensively restrained because fissionable material, the uranium and the plutonium, to make nuclear weapons is very, very peculiar stuff. It's very, very distinctive, and there's not all that much of it in absolute terms, even though it's highly destructive, on this planet. We can comprehensively contain that. Biologicals is going to be much more difficult. But when we think about weapons of mass destruction capability in the hands of non-state actors, we have to recognize that this is not a matter of this policy or that policy, failure of this administration or that. There is, of course, that narrative that we have to attend to, but there is something much more fundamental here, that we are crossing the threshold into a human condition that has never existed before in history. Governments, attending to this fundamental question of security from violence as their first task from the beginning of government in history, have never had to deal with violence capacity that could be wielded of that magnitude by actors of that size. And so we're going to have to be very, very proactive, and we're going to have to be very, very creative in extending control regimes for this capability that are compatible with our political tradition. That's our challenge. And we have to recognize that this is not something that's occurring because there are guys in turbans who are angry at the United States. This is a much more elemental transformation of the environment. Just as the nuclear revolution was not primarily a problem of the Soviet Union bombing us with nuclear weapons, but was the fact that nuclear weapons were now part of the world, so too this new environment that I refer to as omniviolence is one that we're going to have to adjust ourselves to in very creative and far-reaching ways. And it's not simply the destruction of weapons of mass destruction that we're concerned with here. We're concerned with the reaction of governments to this threat. 9/11, so many people were killed. 9/11 to the fifth power is going to give us the Patriot Act to the fifth power. In order to secure in this material context, there's going to be tremendous pressures, tremendous demands to reconfigure government so that it is all penetrating, so that it has the ability to secure us.
Well, that's in a condition of anarchy. So your argument is that if there's international cooperation to reduce the threat, then that also reduces the likelihood of dozens or hundreds of little garrison states, including one here.
That's right. The key lesson that Americans and others should be drawing from our political tradition, extended into the contemporary era of omniviolence, is that the trade-off that we face now is one between the extent to which we can control nuclear capability on a global scale. Global nuclear arms control, the grandson of the Baruch Plan, some version of that comprehensive containment of nuclear material is now necessary for the survival of political liberty within the United States. That's the trade-off we face. And so the friends of political liberty, those who value our limited government constitution and the political liberties that it affords us, and frankly, of course, that should be everyone in the country who has any awareness of why this is such a desirable country to live in. Americans who value limited government should be in the forefront of the effort to create suitably tailored global international regulatory capacities for nuclear capability.
Well, this is a very important point in terms of the contemporary political debate. This discussion of the link between our domestic liberties and the international security order kind of dropped out, at least as far as I can tell, dropped out of American public debate with Kennedy, bear any burden, to promote the cause of liberty, that sort of thing. Carter, human rights, George W. Bush, democracy. And from the 60s to the present, the people who have talked the most about preserving our liberties from the state have been libertarians who either had sort of a lackadaisical attitude towards the conquest of the rest of the human race by various hostile illiberal empires, as though you could have a nice flourishing little Switzerland in North America, surrounded by the Nazis and the Soviets, or else they assumed, another variant of libertarianism assumed that global market forces will simply bring friendly democratic Republican regimes to power everywhere.
Right.
And I've also thought they're half right. The libertarians at the end of the day, they are the heirs to the older American tradition. of defending the republic. We don't want a despotic, consolidated empire.
Right.
But the global strategy of either isolationism or laissez-faire that they've advocated is at odds with the values that they endorse.
Exactly. The libertarian impulse of freedom and of limited government is at the core of the American political tradition. What this libertarianism that we now have tends to forget is that the first liberty, and you pointed to this earlier, the first liberty is freedom from violence. And freedom from violence occurs at both the extremes of anarchy and hierarchy. And this contemporary American libertarianism tends to focus too much on the government as economic regulator and to not appreciate the degree to which the real question is about violence. That's the core question. And so we have in this country what I like to refer to, quoting George Will, he says the Democrats are the party of government, but increasingly the Republicans, and particularly national security state Republicans, they are the party of state. Mm-hmm. And we mean state here in the old, full European monopoly of violence sense. We now have a standing military organization that was necessitated by these outside threats in the 20th century. But whether necessitated or not, we now have this national security apparatus that was far beyond anything that the founders would have imagined being compatible with limited government constitutionalism.
I think it's worse than that when John McCain has been a champion of national service for many years, and this has always had supporters among progressives and liberals. And I find it, this hawk that I am in some ways, the idea that the Army should be the model for society, and that every 18-year-old owes 2 years of service, conscripted to the purpose of the state. That's quite alien to the older American tradition of the militia and the small standing army and limited government.
Definitely. There is, of course, a complex story here about the militia. And when we talk about arms control, that term today tends to evoke the notion of interstate agreements, most of which haven't been very successful, that states are reluctant to enter into, and that libertarians and various conservatives are suspicious of. But we forget that states and republics are systems of arms control. That the monopoly of violence model in the European authoritarian state tradition is radically different from the Republican arms control tradition, which emphasizes a small, highly circumscribed, tied down center, and then ultimately a balance, latent or recessed balance in the form of the states and their militias, and ultimately even in the people numerous and armed.
Well, this is where I think you'll agree the Marxists have gone wrong. Now, you call yourself a historical materialist in the sense you think there are these underlying technological and demographic economic factors. But like you, I think the Marxists mistakenly focused on who controls the means of production, when the real question is who controls the means of coercion.
That's correct. I am an historical materialist, and part of this argument in Bounding Power is to remind us and to reconstruct the historical materialist element in our tradition of limited government and political liberty. But it's not historical materialism of production, it's historical materialism of destruction. And coping with different material contextual environments of differing violence capacities has been elemental to our political tradition. It defines what the problems are that our solutions are only intelligible in terms of.
Well, I think that's an excellent summary of the tradition of American thought and of Western philosophy that you have tried to renovate in Bounding Power. Republican security theory, from the polis to the global village. I recommend it for everyone. I wish we could go on with this conversation, but our time has come to an end. So thank you, Daniel Deudney.
Thank you.